Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the world to the Enlightenment podcast. There is so much to talk about what's going on in the world. And especially at this time, we felt that it was very important to have a dialogue about Palestine, to build awareness, to give some context, and to reach as many people as possible. And I'm doing this podcast with my wife and producing partner, Hanan Katan, who is Palestinian. Today, we will be talking about different things, but our focus will be mainly on the concept of apartheid within the Zionist regime. So, Hanan, where do we start?
Yeah, Shani, let's quickly recap first what we discussed in previous episodes, because I like to do that. We talked about generational trauma facing Palestinians. We talked about the influence of Christian and Jewish Zionism, the Zionist movement's long-term plan, if you like, to colonize Palestine and displace the indigenous Palestinian people. We discussed Palestinian revolt of 1930s, the systematic ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians, and also we talked about the Zionist massacres that began well before the 1948 war, if you like.
Yeah, and that Nakba of 1948 is something we've also covered in a previous episode. And that, as a reminder, led to the forced expulsion of around 750,000 Palestinians. And in 1967, the Nakba saw another wave of displacement, with Israel expanding its control over territory to the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and even parts of Syria and Egypt. And in that wave, over 300,000 Palestinians were also forced out of their homes.
Yeah. And also we talked about the first and second intifadas, the Palestinian uprisings against the illegal Zionist Israeli occupation. And the importance of deep historical context and why Palestinians continue to resist today. We talked about that, as well as the struggle, the Palestinian struggle being an anti-colonial fight against Israeli apartheid, displacement, and subjugation of the Palestinian people.
Yeah. And just to point out that, again, this struggle isn't against Jewish people. It seems to me self-evident, but with media the way it is, it's good to point it out again. It has nothing to do with the Jewish people per se. It is to do with the occupation. It's a struggle against occupation and Zionism as a political ideology. Historically, many Jewish people did not support Zionism, and that same approach is emerging more and more today amongst the Jewish community. Palestinian resistance is a struggle for freedom and self-determination, not a struggle against Judaism.
Yes, and it's also resistance against the ethno-supremacist regime.
Yeah. So with all of that recapped, let's talk about what the term apartheid means, apartheid, literally, and how does it relate to Israel's treatment of Palestinians?
Yeah. So apartheid is a policy of systematic segregation and discrimination, and it's based on usually ethnicity or race. So Shamim, your family, for example, faced firsthand South African apartheid, and they eventually had to leave because of apartheid.
Yeah, they surely did. Apartheid laws in South Africa, of course, this is what people are familiar with when they think about apartheid, dictated racially where non-white people could live. They forced them into non-white areas, restricted nearly every part of their lives. You know, my father was born in the Cape area, and he had to move 3 different times under apartheid as laws began to segregate the most beautiful areas as whites only. You know, my mother could not sit on the same bench as a non-white. My parents could not go to the same cinemas. Sorry, as whites, and they couldn't go to the same cinemas as whites. So it did affect every area of life. And eventually, you know, my parents respectively left South Africa altogether. And my family moved on both sides to the UK and to Canada.
Yeah, and also your first award-winning novel, The World Unseen, which was our second feature film that we produced, is about the Indian experience living in South Africa. And really, what's your family and the stories you hear from South Africans and what they went through throughout apartheid are very familiar and very similar to Palestinians, and who are facing restrictions on movement, where they can live, who they can see. And really, Palestinians also face forced displacement from their homes, to have way to make way, if you like, for settlers to come and illegally take over. So there are many similarities, if you like, to the forced relocations in apartheid South Africa.
Yeah, and the UN has condemned apartheid globally. Why wouldn't it? It's not very human, defining it as a crime against humanity. And just to be clear, groups like Human Rights Watch and Israeli groups like B'Tselem have labeled Israel's policies as apartheid. This is not just us saying it. And just like in South Africa, it's a system that privileges one group while systematically subjugating another group. So let's look at in a little bit more detail about some of these policies. It's easy to talk about it, but what are some of the policies from 1948 onwards that show this kind of apartheid treatment towards Palestinians?
Yeah, there are many examples. Excuse me. So one of them being the absentee property law from 1950, and that allowed Israel to seize Palestinian property that they claim had been abandoned in 1948. Well, I mean, abandoned, really. It was despite the fact that the Zionist colony had displaced and ethnically cleansed and expelled Palestinians from 78% of their land of Palestine. And also the Palestinian land was transferred to Zionist citizens, that 78%, despite them owning less than 7% in 1948. So by doing so, they severed Palestinians from their land and from their livelihoods and just took over, basically.
Yeah, and they made that a law. And then there's also the law of return. So the law of return gives Jews from anywhere in the world automatic rights to Israeli citizenship, while Palestinian refugees who lived there, in some cases for thousands of years, are denied any right to return to their homes, like your mother, for example, or your father's family. This law, I mean, it obviously privileges, in my opinion, one ethnic group over another, and because of that, it entrenches the system of ethnic supremacy.
Yeah. And the Palestinians who remained in Zionist Israel after 1948 and who became Israeli citizens, if you like, also faced significant discrimination. So, for example, the public funding for Palestinians in areas like health, like infrastructure, education, and so on are quite kind of compared to the Jewish communities in Israel are very much discriminated against.
Yeah, and we saw this firsthand ourselves when we were invited to lunch at a friend's house, Dalia, in the Palestinian village that's outside of Tel Aviv.
Yeah, but I just want to say Tel Aviv was founded only in 1909, and it was a suburb of the Mediterranean port of Jaffa or Haifa, which was famous for its orange groves. But anyhow, back to the lunch. I just wanted to specify about Tel Aviv being a suburb of
Yeah,
Jaffa.
absolutely. But when we went to lunch, we were surprised to notice that, the houses were all very nicely kept by the owners and in the Palestinian village area. But the streets themselves in this particular area were full of potholes. There was garbage stacked up very high, if you remember.
Yeah, and we asked Dalia, Allah yarhamha, may her soul rest in peace. We asked her what was going on, and Dalia told us despite the Palestinians paying their taxes on time, the authorities took their sweet time to collect the garbage in Palestinian areas, towns, and villages, and they were not in a hurry to fix their roads on purpose.
Yeah. As a reminder, these same Palestinian citizens were under military rule from 1948 to 1966, despite holding Israeli citizenship. And today, they're often referred to as Israeli Arabs, to, erase this idea of Palestinian identity. And I think that's a systematic erasure that's part of a larger policy that we've seen and we've talked about earlier, um, discussed amongst Zionists themselves very openly that they need to eliminate the history and the identity and the culture of Palestinian people.
Yeah, and this very much continues to create a generational trauma. So both Palestinians in Palestine and in the diaspora live with a deep-rooted scars for decades, or from decades of discrimination, really, from loss, from state-sanctioned erasure of their identity. So most of the older generation of Palestinians are so traumatized that they don't really like to share their experiences of ethnic cleansing. And this is something I noticed not only with my family, but all of my Palestinian friends and their families, their parents and grandparents, and so on.
Yeah, yeah, it's something that's common when people go through those traumas like partition in India, and apartheid in South Africa. People just don't want to discuss it because it is traumatizing. So let's talk about the current apartheid policies in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in East Jerusalem since 1967. So Israel's illegal occupation of these territories has created a dual legal system. We have Israeli settlers living there in huge numbers now, illegally in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and they are subject to civil law, while Palestinians in these areas under occupation are governed by military law.
Yeah, yeah. But I wanted to point out when the UN partitioned Palestine, giving 50% of Palestine to the Zionists, they end up taking 78%, which is illegal. And many people don't talk about that when they talk about coming up with.
So what you're saying is that before 1967, there's an illegal occupation in a sense.
Very much so. Very much so. I think most
It went
people.
beyond the boundaries given by the UN.
Yeah, most people focus on the 67, but actually the crime, if you like, and the illegal occupation started from 48 onwards. But back to to the dual legal system. So this means that one group has rights and freedoms, and the other faces restrictions under these dual, if you like, the dual legal system.
Yeah, and then let's talk about the wall, this literal apartheid wall, keeping people very literally apart that we've seen as well. A 700-kilometer long concrete barrier that cuts straight through Palestinian land. It is 3 times the height of the Berlin Wall, just to give you an example, in places, and it traps Palestinian communities, isolating them from each other, isolating them from their own lands and their own livelihoods as a result. And according to the UN, there are around 645 military checkpoints and barriers across the West Bank. This is not a huge amount of land. And these include permanent checkpoints, roadblocks, and we saw how fast these got thrown up and down, and that was at a much less stressful time than we're in now. And these severely restrict the freedom of movement for Palestinians in the West Bank.
Yeah. I remember growing up as a kind of a young girl and teenager and going through these checkpoints. To give you an example, whenever we crossed from Jordan, the bridge to visit my family in Bethlehem, we would be stuck for hours. We'd be harassed, yelled at, called names, strip searched, which was really horrific to go through. And they even threw my baby sister's nappies and milk formula at the time, and they said it's for security reasons. So really, it was pure humiliation. It's just to discourage Palestinians from visiting. And these checkpoints in occupied Palestine are constant, and they're growing all the time. And they are really a daily obstacle designed to degrade and to dehumanize Palestinians.
Yeah, and it's not just the checkpoints. A Palestinian needs permits for nearly everything, for visiting family from one area to another, for going to work, and Palestinians are sometimes restricted to certain areas. They have ID colors. They have blue, I think, for East Jerusalem, orange for the West Bank, I think maroon for Gaza. And these colors on their IDs stamp them. They determine their rights, and each group has limitations on their movements and certainly on reunifying with each other, which is reminiscent of certain things in history.
Yes, exactly. But even the cars, they have license plates that have different colors, and I think you were quite shocked when you visited a couple of
Yeah,
times.
yeah. Give us some examples of that because I was amazed by that.
Yeah, you were. So for example, for Israeli citizens, they have yellow license plates, which means that they have the freedom of movement to go anywhere, and the Jerusalemites, if you like, they also have yellow plates, but they have specific numbers that indicate which that they are residents and not citizens. So again, with discrimination. The green plates are for West Bank Palestinians and with restriction to travel in the West Bank. But if they wanted to go to East Jerusalem, for example, they would need special permits if they're given those permits. And then lastly, in Gaza, they have white plates, and they have the ultimate restriction of movement, and it's highly controlled.
Okay, so we have we have the wall, we have an ID system, we have colors, different colored license plates and numbers, permits, roadblocks, and restricted access. These seem very systematic, and a structure that is definitely designed to privilege one group over another. Would you agree?
Very much so. And also, let's talk about the resources such as water. The resources are controlled. So, for example, Israeli settlers get to use a lot more water, while Palestinian communities face regular water shortages. Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the thing, Israel, because they frame this as an occupation, rather, so they say that it's not apartheid because it's occupation, and they claim that this separation is about security, but this has been 57 years of illegal occupation where, up to 1 million settlers have now been settled in that occupied land. So it's clearly not temporary. And there is this very clever permanent system of segregation and control.
Yeah. Really labeling it as an occupation is just an attempt to hide the facts. And it's really about controlling the land, the resources, and the entire population. It's not really about security the way that they disguise it to be. It's about maintaining dominance over the Palestinians.
Yeah. And there are three separate systems, I think. A democracy for Jewish citizens. There's a discriminatory system for Palestinian citizens of Israel from 1948, and a military rule for Palestinians within the occupied territories.
Yeah, and Israel's settler colonial project, if you like, is about replacing the indigenous Palestinian people and population with Zionist settlers. So, while at the same time systematically limiting Palestinian rights, um, aiming to secure a Jewish majority state, and as we know, Western powers are helping this, and they always have been.
Yeah, and again, I do like quoting from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Many Israeli leaders have been open in the past about wanting segregation. It is just part of this supremacist idea. Yitzhak Rabin, often talked about as the most, peace-likely person of Israel, said we must find a way to separate ourselves from the Palestinians. Ehud Olmert said we have to separate from the Palestinians to create a clear division between us. And today, this is not the quote anymore, this is me. Israel operates with near impunity. We see it every day, expanding settlements illegally with no comeback, seizing land, walking into Palestinians' houses, segregating Palestinians into isolated enclaves to keep them disconnected from each other and their land. And this has a tremendous and very well targeted impact on their daily lives.
Yeah, and while Palestinians in East Jerusalem have a permanent resident status, they face regular evictions. I mean, we see it with Sheikh Jarrah, we see it every time.
Yeah, there's no feeling of safety by having a residency. And on top of that, the ongoing settler violence, which seems to be rising to all-time highs currently, protected by the Israeli occupation forces. Um, the settlers are highly armed, and Palestinians face daily and harsh repercussions, even for basic acts of resistance or even for just existing. There are Palestinians now who are struggling to harvest olives or graze their animals because there are just regular fires and attacks from settlers.
Yeah, I mean, my family in Bethlehem and others, all Palestinians really in the West Bank, face daily harassment. They have to go through checkpoints if they're given permits, the roadblocks we talked about, and that dictates their every aspect, everyday life of Palestinians, and keeping them very much under constant surveillance and humiliation. As we know, there's a lot of surveillance under the occupation. And it's really apartheid ingrained in the structure of daily life of the Palestinians.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing. You can call it defense, but if you're treating people that way or taking their land illegally and then treating them that way, there's a natural urge to resist because it is human nature to resist being humiliated. It's human nature to push back when you're constantly dehumanized. So to me, this isn't just about basic rights. It's also about the longer goal to have a liberation from this colonial regime, this illegal occupation that denies Palestinians any kind of self-determination. And I think that anti-colonial struggle isn't going to go away.
Yeah, and we talked about Palestinian Sumud resistance. And honestly, colonized people will always resist. We've seen this throughout history.
Yeah. So when we talk about apartheid, the social and the legal implications of using that word makes it very clear that Israel is in violation of international law, and it opens the door to sanctions potentially and boycotts, which is what happened with South Africa eventually.
Yeah, so the Zionist state of Israel's ethnic supremacy and military occupation definitely meet the legal definition of apartheid. I'm not a historian or a lawyer, but we'll be inviting my cousin Victor Katan, who is a lawyer and an author on the subject, a specialist, to discuss apartheid and other things in a future episode.
So cool when you have a cousin who can do all of that stuff, basically. So we're looking forward to that episode with Victor. But just to say, on July 19th, 2024, the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, did issue an advisory opinion declaring that Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem was unlawful, stating that the policies and the practices in these areas amount to apartheid and racial segregation.
Yeah, and this really reinforces the global calls for accountability and for the scrutiny of the ethnic state of Israel and their policies in occupied Palestine. So really, the Palestinian struggle is universal. It's a universal struggle, and it's against colonialism and apartheid.
Yeah, and one we've seen before. As Nelson Mandela said, our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. And he was strangely specific on that point, and we trust Nelson Mandela. And people at the time, Hanan, they didn't have to go and visit South Africa to understand the horror of South Africa's apartheid. It was just self-evident to anybody who had any kind of humanity. And my feeling is that people don't need to visit Palestine to find out about Israeli apartheid. Um, Perhaps our legacy media could do more to make that clear. But it's there.
Yeah, and they're very welcome to visit Palestine. Obviously, I don't think anyone wants to go now, but they can see it for themselves. And I think a lot of people, journalists, just Jewish people, ex-Zionists who have visited Palestine and have seen the occupation firsthand, the discrimination, apartheid, have seen it and were shocked to see it. But again, it's all available online for those who want to see it. It's really not complicated. And really, you can see the dehumanization of Palestinians by the ethnic state of Israel, as I said. But I wanted to be clear again, it's not about Jewish people. It's really about Zionism, and it's about creating one democratic state with multi-parties, if you like, where everyone has an equal vote, equal rights in one state.
Yeah, it's really about recognizing Palestinians as equal human beings, which they are, deserving dignity and self-determination, as everybody does. So, on that happy note, we wrap up, and please join us for our next episode. After that, we'll get into some really interesting guest speakers. But next episode, we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into Gaza and the tragic events that have been unfolding there currently. If you enjoyed our talk, please do like it. Please do subscribe to us on Spotify, on YouTube, wherever works for you. And do share with your friends and family because it helps us tremendously to spread the word. And our aim for doing this podcast, as I said, is to bring our point of view of humanism, which we also try to put across in our books and movies to as many people as possible. And with your support and help, we can do that.
And as always, we believe that stories matter, representation matters. And just to say a big thank you for taking the time to watch. And please remember, as Shireen said, to subscribe, to share, and see you very soon.